The envelope lay on Laura's kitchen counter, simple and unassuming, yet carrying the weight of 1,000 memories she wished she could forget. It was cream-colored, the kind of stationery chosen to seem warm and nostalgic. But to Laura, it felt more like a challenge, a summons she wasn't sure she had the courage to answer. Her name, written in neat cursive, almost mocked her. She didn't need to open it to know what it contained. The high school reunion, a gathering of familiar faces, the same ones she had laughed with, studied with, grown up alongside. And among those faces would be one she dreaded most, David. Laura stared at the invitation longer than she should have, her fingers hesitating to tear it open. She already knew she didn't need the details. The location, the date, the time, none of that mattered. What mattered was that David would be there. He always was. He thrived in gatherings like these, basking in attention, reminding people of the life he claimed he'd built after leaving her. David wasn't just her ex-husband. He was her classmate too. That was the cruel part. Their lives had been intertwined long before their disastrous marriage, and in some ways, she had never escaped him. He had followed her through memories, through rumors, through whispers she couldn't silence. Even after the divorce, he found ways to cast his shadow over her. She remembered the way he used to humiliate her, not just in private but in public. At dinner parties, when friends gathered, he would chuckle and say, "Laura tried cooking tonight, but let's just say the smoke alarm had a better meal than we did." Everyone laughed, because David knew how to tell a story. And Laura, sitting quietly at his side, smiled weakly, her cheeks burning, knowing that correcting him would only make things worse. Those were the kinds of moments that had defined their marriage. Not the quiet evenings when she tried to hold the pieces together, not the efforts she'd put into making a home. No, the world only ever saw what David wanted them to see, Laura, the failed wife. And now, years later, that same narrative had followed her. At social events, she heard it in whispers, "Poor Laura, David said she could barely keep a house together." Others would nod sympathetically, as if it were true, never asking her side of the story. David had crafted the tale, and the world believed it. She pressed her hand against the envelope, almost crushing it. Why go at all? Why walk willingly into a room where she would be mocked, diminished, and picked apart? She could already imagine David, standing in the center of the old-school gymnasium, with a circle of familiar faces hanging on his every word. He would glance at her, smirk, and with a loud voice that carried across the room, remind everyone why he had left her. Laura closed her eyes, letting the memory play out in her head. She felt the sting before it even happened. She saw the laughter, heard the chuckles, and felt that same old humiliation sinking into her bones. Part of her wanted to rip the envelope to shreds, throw it away, and pretend it had never arrived. But another part, quieter, yet stronger, whispered something else. Why should you hide? Why should you let him dictate your life even now? Laura drew in a long breath. She had spent years rebuilding herself, years learning that her worth was not defined by the cruel words of a man who never truly saw her. And yet, here she was, still hesitating, still letting his ghost decide her choices. Her hands trembled slightly as she finally tore open the envelope. The paper inside was bright, the ink crisp. Class of 2005 reunion, it read, with the date, the venue, and the cheerful promise of an evening of laughter, friendship, and memories. She almost laughed at the irony. For her, the evening promised nothing of the sort. She set the invitation down, staring at it until the words blurred. She thought of her classmates, the ones who had seen her walk down the aisle with David, radiant and hopeful, never suspecting what was to come. They had seen the fairy tale beginning, but not the unraveling. And David had made sure they only ever saw his version of the ending. For a moment, Laura thought she might decline. She could stay home, safe, far away from the sneers and sideways glances. No one would question her absence. After all, hadn't she been absent from so many things since the divorce? But something shifted inside her. A flicker of resolve, faint but undeniable. Why should David's voice be the only one they remembered? Why should his lies be the story that lived on? Laura stood, her shoulders squaring. She would go. She didn't know how the evening would unfold. She didn't know what words David would throw her way, what laughter he might provoke at her expense. But she knew this, she was no longer the timid woman who smiled through the humiliation. She had endured too much, grown too much, to let him destroy her again. She picked up the invitation and slipped it back into its envelope. Her heart still pounded, fear still lingered, but behind it was something stronger, a quiet determination. For once, she would not shrink back. The reunion awaited, and so did David. And Laura was ready. Laura's hands trembled as she adjusted the fabric of her dress in the mirror. The morning sun streamed through the curtains, golden and soft, but it did nothing to calm the unease twisting inside her. She smoothed the navy blue fabric for the 100th time, a simple choice of attire that clung in the right places without being ostentatious. She wanted to look composed, dignified, untouchable. Sequins or glitter would have been armor for others, but Laura had chosen restraint. Dignity. It wasn't vanity driving her, it was survival. David always knew how to turn even her smallest choices into a flaw. She could still hear him, the words sharp as glass, "You'll never do better than me, Laura. You're ordinary. You'll crumble without me." That voice haunted her, even now. For a fleeting moment, she considered abandoning the whole idea. She could stay home, let the night pass, avoid the fresh wound she knew he would try to cut into her. But then another memory struck her, the smug look on his face during the divorce proceedings, the way he whispered with certainty that she would never rise beyond the shadow he left her in. That was why she had to go. Not for him, not for the classmates who had been eager spectators to his cruelty, but for herself. The drive to the reunion felt endless. Every streetlight, every turn of the wheel, was a reminder of how close she was to stepping back into a place where David thrived, at the center of attention, adored by laughter that too often came at her expense. When the hotel finally came into view, its glass facade gleaming in the afternoon light, Laura's chest tightened. This was no gymnasium like the one where they had once danced at prom. This was polished, sophisticated, daunting. Inside, the cool air wrapped around her, mingling with the sounds of chatter, glasses clinking, and bursts of laughter. The lobby buzzed with life, classmates gathered in clusters, faces older yet instantly familiar. There was an undeniable electricity, excitement tinged with judgment, as though everyone was silently measuring one another against the passage of time. And there he was. David. Tall, broad-shouldered, his dark hair slicked back the way he'd worn it since college. He stood in the middle of a crowd, a glass of wine in hand, his gestures animated as he told a story. His audience hung on every word, laughter breaking out at all the right places. He hadn't changed. Not at all. Laura paused, her heartbeat quickening. The sight of him brought a rush of memories she tried hard to bury. The cruelty disguised as jokes. The belittling remarks whispered in public. The years of playing the perfect audience to his performances. Still, she kept walking. A few heads turned as she passed. Some classmates smiled, polite but curious. Others whispered, eyes flicking from her to David as though her presence alone was an unspoken punchline. She caught fragments of murmurs, echoes of the old narrative David had crafted long ago. She wasn't a good wife. She couldn't keep him happy. She thought she was better than she was. Laura made her way to the refreshment table, focusing on the simple act of pouring water into a glass. Her hand was steady now. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing her tremble. Then, Just as she raised the glass, his voice cut through the air. Well, well, well. Look who finally showed up. The words carried easily across the room, drawing attention like a spotlight. Laura turned slowly. David was approaching, that familiar smirk plastered on his face, the one he wore before every sharp remark, every calculated humiliation. His entourage followed, eager for the drama. Laura, he said, dragging her name out as if it were a punchline. Didn't think you'd have the courage to come. She met his gaze, her face calm though her pulse raced. It's a reunion, David. Not a battlefield. He laughed, loud and theatrical, earning chuckles from those around him. Sweetheart, everything's a battlefield with you. He leaned closer, his voice carrying for all to hear. Tell me, did you finally learn how to cook? Or are you still burning toast the way you used to? No wonder you're alone tonight. No man could survive your housekeeping. The laughter that followed was harsher this time. Each chuckle was a weight pressing against her chest. For a moment, the walls she had built threatened to crack. But then she straightened. Laura looked him square in the eye and said, "Funny how you never stop repeating the same lines. Almost like you need them to convince yourself you made the right choice." The smirk faltered. Just briefly, but it was enough. His mask slipped. He recovered quickly, tossing out another laugh, brushing it off. Same old Laura. Always pretending she's clever. Always reaching above her station. Turning back to his audience, he tried to pull them back into his orbit. But Laura didn't shrink away this time. She lifted her chin, her composure intact, and let him speak. Because deep down, she knew something David didn't. Tonight, his words wouldn't be the last ones that mattered. The laughter rolled like a wave across the reunion hall, bouncing off polished marble floors and chandeliers that dripped with golden light. Laura stood steady, her glass of water untouched in her hand, but every fiber of her being urged her to run. She had known this would happen, David basking in the spotlight, the crowd hanging on his every barb, waiting to see if she would crumble the way she once had. David thrived in moments like this. He took a slow sip from his wineglass, letting the silence stretch just long enough for tension to thicken, then tilted his head with feigned curiosity. "So, Laura," he said, his voice carrying easily across the room. "What have you been up to all these years?" "I heard rumors, none of them impressive." A ripple of chuckles followed. The way he framed the question wasn't about curiosity, it was bait, a trap designed to corner her into silence or stammering. Laura lifted her chin. "I've been building a life. Working hard. Taking care of what matters." It wasn't flashy, but it was true. And the calm in her tone unsettled him more than she realized. David's eyes narrowed. He gave her a smile laced with venom. "Building a life? Come now. You always hated housework. You couldn't even make a decent dinner. How long did that last before someone got tired of your half-hearted efforts?" The group around him erupted in laughter again, some out of genuine amusement, others because it was easier than challenging him. Laura's pulse quickened. She remembered nights when those same words had been whispered in their kitchen, behind closed doors. Back then, she'd let them pierce her, believing them. But now, standing under the bright lights of the reunion, she understood something she hadn't before. His cruelty had always been a performance. And she had been the stage. A woman from their graduating class, her hair silver now but eyes still sharp, leaned closer to David. "You always did have a sharp tongue," she said. "Poor Laura. Must have been hard living up to your standards." The woman's words were half amused, half sympathetic, but David seized on them like fuel. He puffed his chest. "Hard? It was impossible. I carried us. She just drifted. Always dreaming above her station, never grounded in reality. That's why I had to move on. Laura's hand tightened around the glass. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, weighing her reaction. Some were curious, others judgmental, but all of them expected her to shrink, to bow her head and give David the satisfaction of another easy victory. But she didn't. Instead, she set the glass down gently and said, "Strange, David. I don't remember you carrying us. I remember you criticizing, belittling, but carrying? No. That's not how I recall it." The words were steady, almost quiet, but they cut through the noise. For a moment, there was no laughter. His smile twitched. He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a growl meant to keep his audience engaged. "Careful, Laura. Don't rewrite history. Everyone here knows what you were, a disappointment. You should thank me for putting up with you as long as I did." The cruelty hung in the air. A few people gasped softly, others looked away, uncomfortable. Yet some smirked, eager for more drama. Laura's throat burned, but she swallowed hard and met his gaze. "If that's how you need to see it, David, go ahead. I'm not here to change your story." And then she turned, not away, not toward the door, but toward the table of alumni signing a memory book. Her back straight, her steps even, she walked as though his words were no heavier than air. That was what rattled him most. He followed, his voice rising, trying to claw back the attention she had quietly taken. "See that? Always running away. Can't even defend herself. Some things never change." This time the laughter was scattered, hesitant. The cruelty was no longer playing as well as it once did. A few classmates exchanged uneasy looks, whispers spreading like a current. Laura signed her name in the memory book, her pen steady, her expression unreadable. The silence between each stroke of ink was louder than his jeers. When she turned back, David stood a few feet away, his jaw tight, his knuckles whitening around his glass. He had expected collapse. He had expected tears. Instead, he was left with something far worse, defiance cloaked in grace. And though Laura felt her heart pounding against her ribs, though every part of her wanted to scream or flee, she understood something vital: she had already taken back a measure of power simply by refusing to break. The humiliation was still there, yes. The whispers still buzzed. But for the first time, the performance wasn't his alone. The audience was beginning to see another act, another side of the story. Laura held his gaze for one long, piercing second. Then she moved back into the crowd, not hiding, but walking as if she belonged, because she did. David forced a laugh, desperate to recover. "She hasn't changed a bit," he said loudly, but his voice carried a hollow edge. And in that hollow space, in the shifting eyes of their classmates, Laura felt the tide begin, slowly, to turn. The reunion hall buzzed with chatter and clinking glasses, but Laura felt as though every sound pressed against her ears, dull and heavy. She had endured David's jabs, the laughter, the half-sympathetic glances. And though she had stood her ground, she knew he wasn't finished. David lingered nearby, prowling like a man who had lost control of the stage but refused to step off it. His smirk had tightened into something sharper, more desperate. He leaned toward a small group of men from their class, his voice carrying just enough for Laura to hear. "She's putting on a brave face," he said, chuckling. "But don't be fooled. Laura was never cut out for a real life. Couldn't cook, couldn't manage a house, and sure as hell couldn't keep a husband. That's why she's alone now. She's probably scraping by, hoping no one notices." The words bit at her, but less sharply than they once would have. Because she wasn't alone, not anymore. And soon, that truth would reveal itself in a way David could never have predicted. the doors to the hall swung open, and a quiet hush rippled through the crowd. At first, only a few noticed, but the silence spread like a tide until all eyes turned. Jonathan Pierce stepped inside. He was tall, broad-shouldered, his salt and pepper hair neatly styled, his presence commanding without a word. A tailored navy suit hugged his frame, the kind of suit that whispered of wealth and influence. But it wasn't the clothes that drew the sudden hush, it was the recognition. Faces around the room lit with realization. Whispers broke out. "That's Jonathan Pierce." "The Jonathan Pierce? The one on the Forbes list? He's the trustee for the school foundation." Laura's heart quickened as Jonathan's gaze swept the room. Then, without hesitation, his eyes landed on her. A smile broke across his face, warm and certain, as though she were the only person who mattered in the glittering hall. "Sweetheart," he said, his voice rich and steady, carrying across the room with ease. "Sorry I'm late. A last-minute board meeting kept me tied up." The air shifted. Heads turned, whispers became louder. "Sweetheart." The billionaire had just walked into the room, and he was calling Laura his wife. Laura felt the weight of every eye on her, but for once, it didn't sting. It lifted. She saw the shock ripple through the crowd, saw mouths drop open, and in the corner, saw David's face blanch as though the floor had vanished beneath him. Jonathan crossed the room with unhurried confidence, each step echoing with authority. He reached her and, without hesitation, bent to kiss her cheek. His hand found hers, warm and steady, and he looked into her eyes as though they were the only two people there. "You look stunning," he said softly. "I hope I didn't miss too much." Laura's throat tightened. "Nothing worth mentioning." The crowd murmured, their curiosity sharpening into awe. For years, David had told anyone who'd listened that Laura was a failure, a woman destined to be alone, to scrape by unnoticed. And now here she stood, the billionaire Jonathan Pierce at her side, calling her sweetheart, holding her hand as though she were the crown jewel of the evening. David stumbled forward, his voice catching. "Wait, you're with him? This can't be real." Jonathan's eyes flicked toward David for the first time, calm but piercing. "And you are?" The question landed like a blow. David's mouth opened, then closed. For a man who thrived on recognition, on controlling the room, to be dismissed as irrelevant was a humiliation deeper than any words. He stammered, before catching himself. "I'm her ex-husband." Jonathan's expression didn't change, but his grip on Laura's hand tightened just slightly, a subtle reassurance. He turned back to her, ignoring David completely. "You ready to go?" he asked. Laura nodded, her lips curving into the faintest smile. For the first time all evening, she felt no heaviness in her chest, no sting of old wounds. Just freedom. Around them, the whispers grew. Some looked at her with wide-eyed admiration, others with envy. But all of them saw her differently now, not as the woman David had painted her to be, but as the woman Jonathan, a man of immense power, had chosen and cherished. David's face twisted, his bravado crumbling. He sputtered, desperate to reclaim the moment. You don't know what she's like. She's not wife material. She never was." Jonathan turned then, his voice even, his tone cutting. "Funny. I've never met anyone more capable. In business, in life, in grace. Laura's more than wife material, she's the best decision I ever made." The room fell utterly silent. Laura's eyes burned, not with shame, but with something far brighter. Vindication. She stood taller, her hands still clasped in Jonathan's, and realized the tide had fully turned. The humiliation David had worked so hard to stage had dissolved, leaving him exposed, scrambling, forgotten. Jonathan squeezed her hand again and smiled. "Shall we?" She nodded, and together they walked through the hall, heads high, every step echoing with a reversal David could never undo. And behind them, David stood frozen, watching the one woman he had mocked, dismissed, and tried to destroy walk out with everything he could never be: respect, dignity, and love that no cruelty could touch. The night air was cooler than Laura expected, almost crisp, as if the world itself was offering her a breath of relief after the storm inside. The parking lot stretched wide and empty under soft pools of lamplight, their glow casting long shadows that trailed behind her and Jonathan as they walked side by side. She hadn't realized how tightly she'd been holding her shoulders until they began to relax, her body slowly unclenching from years of rehearsed defensiveness. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Jonathan didn't rush her. He never did. His hands stayed warm against hers, steady and unshakable, grounding her in the silence. It was only when they reached his car, sleek, understated, powerful, so unlike the fragile pretense David had always flaunted, that Laura finally breathed out the words lodged in her chest. "I thought tonight would break me," she admitted, her voice soft, almost disbelieving. "Walking in there, I felt like I was walking straight back into the worst years of my life. Back into his shadow." Jonathan leaned casually against the car, watching her with that patient calm she had come to love. "And yet," he said gently, "you didn't break." Laura almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because of the quiet astonishment in his tone. She shook her head. "I've replayed this moment in my mind so many times. Facing him. Hearing him humiliate me in front of everyone. I always imagined I'd crumble, or run. But tonight," her eyes lifted, catching Jonathan's. "Tonight I stood my ground. Because you were there." Jonathan's expression softened. "You gave yourself too little credit, Laura. I was there, yes. But you were the one who spoke. You were the one who let him know he couldn't define you anymore." The words sank deep, yet part of her resisted. Years of David's criticism didn't dissolve overnight. "For so long," she said quietly, "I believed every word he ever told me. That I wasn't enough. That no one could want me. That I couldn't be loved without conditions." She paused, her chest tightening. "I thought maybe he was right." Jonathan reached out, brushing his thumb over her hand, not to silence her, but to anchor her. "Men like David need to believe their cruelty is truth. It's how they keep power. But truth doesn't belong to them, Laura. Tonight you showed him that. You showed everyone." Her throat tightened, not with grief this time, but with something warmer, gratitude, maybe, or even awe. She had expected Jonathan to defend her, to confront David with his wealth, his status, his power. But he hadn't needed to. He had simply stood beside her, steady and unwavering, while she reclaimed her voice. And in that quiet, Laura understood something she hadn't before. David had once made her feel invisible. Jonathan made her feel seen. David had made her feel like a burden. Jonathan made her feel like a partner. David had measured her worth in chores done, meals cooked, obedience given. Jonathan measured her worth in nothing more, and nothing less, than who she was. For the first time in years, she felt the weight of her own dignity return to her chest, not borrowed, not given, but hers. As Jonathan opened the car door for her, she paused. "Do you know what I kept thinking, when he was standing there, tearing me apart again?" "What?" Jonathan asked, his voice gentle. "That I wasn't alone anymore," she said, her lips curving into a faint, almost trembling smile. "That no matter what he said, no matter how loud or cruel he got, I wasn't going to face it on my own. Because you'd be there, not to fight for me, but to remind me that I could fight for myself." Jonathan held her gaze, pride flickering in his eyes like a quiet flame. "That's all I ever want for you." Not to silence the voices of the past for you, but to make sure you never forget the strength of your own. Laura slid into the seat, the leather cool and smooth beneath her hands. The weight that had clung to her shoulders for years was gone, replaced by a stillness she didn't quite recognize but knew she wanted to keep. As the car pulled away from the reunion hall, its windows glowing dimly in the distance, Laura looked out at the night. The laughter from the hall, the whispers, the sting of David's voice, they all seemed smaller now, shrinking in the rearview mirror. She realized then that it wasn't just about proving him wrong. It wasn't about showing him she had found happiness, or wealth, or even love. It was about proving something to herself, that she had never been what he said she was. She had always been more. Jonathan reached over, intertwining his fingers with hers. She glanced at him, her heart swelling with something stronger than relief. Pride. Gratitude. Love. And for the first time in years, those feelings weren't shadowed by doubt. Laura leaned back, her smile soft but certain. "You know," she said, her voice steady now, "I think that was the first reunion I've ever left feeling whole." Jonathan chuckled, squeezing her hand. Then it was worth it. And as the night unfolded before them, quiet and endless, Laura knew that the life she carried forward from here would not be defined by the man who once tried to break her, but by the one who helped her remember she was never broken at all. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of betrayal, redemption, and unexpected twists.